Now, you started by comparing Spinoza and Leibniz with each other. Now that we've expounded their views at some individual length each, I'd like to come back to a joint question, so to speak. How would you assess their relative contributions to the history of philosophy?
Well, they contribute to different strands in it. Spinoza was much deplored in his own age. The thing you questioned, his sincerity in his religious professions, was very much questioned in his own age. People talked of the awful atheist Spinoza. Frequently, free thinkers like Hume and Bale did this. And it wasn't until the Romantic movement in Germany, end of the 18th, early 19th century, with people like Herder and Goethe, that Spinoza came more or less into his own. And he's always been an object of veneration because of his personal dignity, this unworldly withdrawal from ambition and self-affirmation and cutting a dash and all that. That was utterly foreign to Spinoza. He's a person of great sincerity. His own activities, his own life story is perfectly in accordance with his philosophic doctrines. And he's admired, therefore, but he doesn't appeal enormously to what one might call the more technical kind of philosopher. Whereas I would be inclined to say, of all the great philosophers of the post-medieval world, there is none who makes a more immediate appeal to the technical philosophers, at least of the Anglo-Saxon world, in the 20th century, because of his unwearying professionalism, his abstention from any form of rhetoric.
It's noticeable that Bertrand Russell, who wrote some 60 books, only wrote one book about another philosopher, and that was about Leibniz, with whom I think he probably must have identified very considerably. But one thing that strikes me about both of them, and I'd like to hear your views about this, is something that is in a sense unmodern about both of them, is that they were both profoundly and sophisticatedly versed in mathematics, and indeed Leibniz was a mathematician of genius and a mathematical physicist of genius. And yet both of them had this overwhelming concern with God and the place of God in the scheme of things. Now, I get the impression that there's a kind of subtext to a lot of this philosophy, that what they're actually trying to do is to maintain a conception of the world which can accommodate the new mathematical physics of Newton, but which has God in it. Do you think that's true?
Yes, I think that's certainly true. I'd just like to interpose, first of all, that despite all that mathematical-looking apparatus in Spinoza, he wasn't a mathematician, really. He'd studied a little mathematics, but he's in a completely different world from Leibniz, who, as you rightly say, is a major creative figure in the history of mathematics. In Spinoza's case, it's rather like the apparatus of pastoral poetry, and a pastoral poet is not really an expert on the culture of sheep or lamb rearing or anything like that. At any rate, but ignoring that for the moment, I think you're quite right about there is a common topic that obsesses them in some way, in which they both resolve in their very different ways, which is finding a place for religion in the world as it had come to seem in the light of the great post-Galileo and after discoveries about the nature of the physical world. Descartes' technique was more or less to sell ground, to say, well, the material world is unthinking matter, and that's where the Galilean rules prevail. But as well as the material world, there are individual human souls, and there's God. These are purely spiritual entities, both free, both detached from, though in various ways associated with, the material world. In other words, it was like splitting Germany into two, a demarcation. That area is given to physics, this area is preserved for religion. Both Spinoza and Leibniz are understandably dissatisfied with this kind of Solomonic carve-up of the cosmic baby, and are both anxious to combine religion and science. Spinoza does it, in effect, by adopting the world picture of 17th century science and then recommending religious attitudes towards the world so conceived. Leibniz, the other way round, wants to say the world is, in fact, much more as religion represents it, a much more spiritual affair than science realizes, and yet we can rest the whole of the scientific conception of phenomena on an essentially religious understanding of the world, as the working out of the purposes of an infinitely intelligent being, namely God.
Thank you very much, Anthony Quinton.